66 CE marked the beginning of the Great Jewish Revolt, also known as the First Roman-Jewish War. Josephus tells us in his Jewish Wars, Book 2, 8.1, that Coponius had placed new taxes upon the Jews. Later, in that same book by Josephus, in 14.5, we learn that the Greeks were sacrificing birds outside of the Jewish synagogues. These reasons are attributed as to being the reason for the war itself. Both Judea and Rome suffered numerous social, political, and economical strifes during this time frame. For example, Rome, after the suicide of Nero in 68 CE, saw successors Galba and Vitellius live short, long stints as emperor. Vitellius was ultimately ousted by Vespasian, who ironically was appointed by Nero to quell the rebellion in 66 CE. Vespasian, upon taking the throne, leaves his son Titus behind to clean up the mess. It is also Vespasian and Titus who cornered Josephus, who at this time was a general in the Jewish army. Outside of these factors, the war itself is important, because contained within the war, in the 70 CE, marked the fall and destruction of the Second Jewish Temple. And in 73 CE, we saw the fall of Masada and the end of the war itself. But the fall of the Second Temple is important because it's referenced and mentioned by the writers of the Synoptic Gospels. Many scholars will try to attest a dating of around 62 CE as to when Mark actually wrote his Gospel. This, in my opinion, is erroneous for the simple fact that there was no way for Mark to know that the temple was being destroyed prior to when it was destroyed in 70 CE. Furthermore, Mark, as well as the Synoptic Gospels, are not a prophetic work. They are viewed, for example, in the Scofield Bible, as being histories. Histories do not contain prophecies, nor can a prophecy be fulfilled within a historical work. But interestingly, when we look at Mark itself, for example, in Mark chapter 11, we learn about Jesus' infamous altercation with the money changers and their tables inside the temple. Later in Mark 13:1, it says, "As he was going out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, 'Teacher, behold what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings.'" The next verse, 13.2, it says, "And Jesus said to them, 'Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another, which will not be torn down.'" Now what's important is in Mark 14:58, as the high priest had attempted to arrest Jesus and bring him before the leadership, they said, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another made without hands.'" Now obviously, metaphorically, we're talking about the temple of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus. But if we were to look at it literally, Jesus never says anything about destroying the temple in 70 CE. All he mentions are the great buildings. The Greek lexicon representing buildings in this passage is okedame. Okedame is defined as being the building of many buildings or numerous buildings. In the previous verse, in 13:1, the Greek lexicon used for temple is theros. This is defined as being a sacred place of worship to a god, essentially a sacred temple, the Jewish temple. But Jesus never uses in his speech, in his quotation, this particular Greek lexicon. Now, as I previously stated, the majority of scholars date or attribute a date of sometime around 70-71 CE as to when the gospel was written. Interestingly, as I've pointed out, Jesus doesn't mention the temple. He's not even quoted as talking about destroying the temple. He's quoted in Mark as talking about the many buildings, which I perceive to be the many buildings of Jerusalem. After the fall of Masada in 73 CE, we learn of the Jewish diaspora and the destruction of numerous Jewish buildings and synagogues, and the building up of new Roman statues and buildings within the province of Judea. Therefore, I conclude that Mark wrote his gospel sometime after or around 74 CE. Quite simply, if you look at the words and the context of them, he's referring to the many buildings of Jerusalem, not specifically the temple. And there's no way that knowledge of the diaspora and the temples and the many great buildings resulting in the end of the First Roman-Jewish War could have been known by Mark previous to that date. And those building programs and destruction of the Jewish buildings took place after the fall of Masada in 73 CE. So we can wipe out this early dating of 62 CE, and for the reasons I have demonstrated, attribute a date sometime around 74 or 75 CE as to when Mark was actually first written. And it is apparent that Mark is the first gospel because all the other synoptic gospels copy and use Mark as a source, and that is unanimously agreed upon. So for these reasons, we learn that Mark was written around 74-75, which is around 50 years, 40 years I should say, after the supposed crucifixion of Christ, which has to place Mark as a second-hand source, not a first-hand source. May the gift of reason light your way.